The Dragon's Return, Chapter 3, The Darkest Hour, Part 3. Lancelot was feeling a little hopeless as he struck the flint. He'd pushed a little too long, and night was rapidly falling. Sir Lancelot. The voice was echoing and inhuman. His hand flew to the hilt of his sword. He barely noticed Merlin's hand flop off the bedroll he'd placed her onto until the tiny ripples from her fingers in the water caught his attention. The last thing she needed right now was to be wet. It would only add to the cold. But the water had turned silver where she touched it. He paused, not quite drawing his sword. Be at peace. He blinked as small figures seemed to rise from the water. They were without real shape, seemingly made of the water itself, with bright reflective gold eyes and kind smiles. Drops of water like rain rose from the river. We mean you no harm. We wish only to help, the first figure said, and Lancelot let out a breath. What are you? He asked. After he said it, he realized how rude it must sound, but several of the creatures, spirits maybe, laughed. We are Villia, spirits of brooks and streams. The tear between worlds has allowed all manner of spirits to wander free, not just the evil. This cannot be allowed to continue, the spirit said as the others approached the place where Merlin lay, her hand dangling into the water. The once and future king will need both of you before this is done. But Merlin, he said, and stopped himself as the glow of the silvery waters spread and deepened. Slivers of silver seemed to run through Merlin's veins down to the hand where it was dangling in the water. She was beginning to glow a soft gold. The young warlock is stronger than she allows anyone to believe, herself included. She has a great power and a destiny that has been written since the dawn of time. Magic will not be allowed to pass until her time comes, the spirit said, and Lancelot frowned. The wording was odd. Sleep, Sir Knight. You will be safe here for the night. We will stay and guard against the Dorocha. The floating drops of water were glowing brightly, and the light Merlin was giving off by now might as well be a beacon. He let himself rest against the tree behind him, watching as the river spirits worked their magic. He had no idea what was actually happening, but Merlin's shivers had died down and she was breathing well again. For the first time in days, he felt safe enough to close his eyes and rest. It had been 2 days since she'd been touched by the Dorocha, and even with the Villia purging the death-cold touch from her, Merlin still wasn't warm. She wasn't sure she would ever be warm again. Her fingers were stiff, and the beds of her nails were still slightly blue. Even now, as she and Lancelot ran desperately, they had fallen asleep. That hadn't been the plan. The horses had fled as the screeching grew louder. Just as Merlin felt her hope shrivel, the tree above them burst into flames. She and Lancelot hit the deck. Wasn't your best plan, Lancelot said, seizing her by the arms and pulling her out from under the burning branches. Wasn't me, Merlin insisted, and a roar sounded overhead. Merlin cried out in joy as Kilgara landed in the field next to them. She ran forward as a figure dismounted the dragon. Balinor met his daughter halfway and pulled her into a hug. The small dragon around his shoulders scampered onto Merlin's shoulders, and she laughed, even as Kilgara set fire to several more trees, the flames roaring around them, though they did not spread to the woods. The light bathed them in warmth as the little blue dragon, barely the size of a full-grown cat, nuzzled at Merlin's face. Merlin pulled back, laughing with tears in her eyes as she ran a finger down the small dragon's back. How did you know we needed help? I haven't called, Merlin said, and Kilgara seemed to bristle. You should have, he boomed, making Lancelot jump slightly. Despite being told several stories about the large gold dragon, he'd never met him in person before. The cold has touched you, young warlock. the dragon said as Balinor pulled Merlin back into a hug, rubbing her arms as though that would help to warm her. It was me or Arthur. We were trapped in a dead end. I couldn't let it touch him, Merlin said, sounding somewhat petulant. Kilgara nodded slightly.
Arthur is out here as well,
Balinor asked. Merlin nodded. He's got a 2-day lead on us. Without the horses, we'll never catch up to them, Merlin bit out.
That's not quite true,
Balinor said to Kilgara, who let out a little puff of flame in annoyance but did not protest.
We will not be able to take off until dawn,
the larger dragon stated. Merlin grinned. You are going to have to teach me how you get him to actually listen to you, Merlin said to her father, who smiled.
That will come with time, Merlin,
Balinor said, something sad behind his eyes. Before she could think about it, he smiled again.
Do you have the ring I sent you?
She nodded, and pulled out the leather cord she wore the ring on.
Here,
he said, holding out a hand. Merlin handed it over, and Balinor spoke a spell over the ring, not questioning the second ring there.
Put that on. It holds a warming spell. It'll help a bit, but I'm afraid only time will take the cold from you fully,
he said. Thank you, Merlin said, slipping the necklace back on. She smiled at him. As soon as the first finger of dawn made itself known, the 3 passengers climbed onto the large dragon's back. Lancelot looked a little gray at the prospect of flying to the others, but their choices were limited as it was. With the added weight and attempts to avoid villages and instigating further panic in the kingdom with the supposedly dead dragon flying overhead, they arrived at a fortress that sat less than a day's ride from the Isle of the Blessed as dusk fell. Merlin thought she spotted figures emerging from the fortress as Kilgara set fire to the tree line.
Balinor, what are you doing here?
Was Arthur's greeting. He hadn't seen her. The way they'd been riding and the way Kilgara had landed put his spines between her and the knights, and her on the side of the burning tree line as she slid off his back. Lancelot had been on the same side as Balinor, as he seemed more at risk of falling, this being his first time on Dragonback.
Lancelot.
Arthur's voice broke.
How's Merlin?
He asked. Lancelot, who was bent double trying not to be ill, shook his head. Bad news. I'm still around, Merlin said as she rounded Kilgara's neck. Arthur's torch fell to the grass as he ran forward, pulling her into his arms. He cradled her face in his hands and pulled her into a kiss.
You're alive,
he said as he pulled back, laying his forehead to hers. Well, we had some help, Merlin said with a grin, glancing up at the large gold dragon, which was smiling nearly condescendingly down at them.
2 sides of the same coin indeed,
Kilgara rumbled. Gawain dropped his sword.
The dragon talks,
he exclaimed, making everyone laugh.
And apparently makes smaller dragons,
Arthur said, noticing the blue dragon still stubbornly laying around Merlin's shoulders.